Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in a pandemic still. It's easy for some of us to start to discount that, but it's a total reality. Several billion people with a B are still not vaccinated, and that will kick back. And so it's an unethical in 1,000 ways. It's an overheating planet, human heated planet. There's deep vulnerabilities around the world that are not being addressed, creating a climate divide, as I wrote in 2007 in the New York Times. That climate divide exists within countries, even within a community, even along a single road where there's someone who's vulnerable to heat and someone who has an air conditioner. So there's a lot of work to be done. And in Bali, in Indonesia, a part of the world that's prone to a huge range of that has a huge range of natural hazards, some of which I had a close look at a long time ago. A meeting is just concluded of the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency and several other related sessions. I've brought together here on our Friday news review some wonderful selection of folks, journalists, experts, scientists, to see how we can maybe have, I created a fake newspaper there, the Safer Times. You know, I used to work at the New York Times, and most of what newspapers like mine cover are events. When a hazard is unleashed and people die or dislocated or property is lost, that's news. Unfortunately, we don't tend to cover when there isn't a disaster, and the disaster is not the natural hazard. The disaster is the outcome. So what do we do in journalism? What do we do as communicators within our professions in the sciences, in policy, to help reduce risk on the ground where before the hazard is unleashed, whether that hazard has got a human component like global warming, or whether it's disruption of food supplies like those that are intentionally happening because of the invasion of Ukraine, or a volcano erupts, or an earthquake strikes, or a flood strikes. So can we have safer times, literally, not just the media, but the in our communities and the world at large? That's the question. So the UN, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, again, this every 2 years meets, and it was in Indonesia. Two of my guests right now, and others are coming on, are there. They're at the conference, or wrapping up. Roger Plowardi, who's at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, climate-focused scientist for a long time, and Josh DiVincenzo, who is a colleague of mine at Columbia. Oh, by the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Andy Revkin at the Climate School and Earth Institute at Columbia University and the Sustain What program. Josh has a PhD. He's focused on the education components of how do we, again, at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, which is increasingly becoming a global center for disaster preparedness. It's great to have you both here. And Vikande from the Philippines, a journalist who is trying to tip the balance toward covering solutions and preparedness and risk reduction as a beat. So it's great to have you all. Let's just start in with who you are and why you're, what brought you to being who you are so far. Maybe Mavik, could you just give us a quick hello and what drove you to cover the environment? Why are you a journalist? So just a very quick introduction to yourself.
Sorry, okay.
That's okay.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm Vikande, an environmental journalist from the Philippines. So currently, I'm a fellow at Solutions Journalism Network. So I'm focused on covering responses to social problems, especially on food systems.
Mm.
Okay. So when I saw Andy's email, I got curious, and because it's really aligned with what solutions journalism is trying to achieve, which is to be more proactive than reactive. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, we are all, there's so many people I meet who are trying to tip that balance. And Roger, you're at NOAA. Most of what NOAA did historically was weather forecast, ocean system dynamics, and identifying the hazards and letting us know about them. I can't function on a daily basis as a journalist without relying on the extreme weather forecasts and everything. And now the climate change component puts us all on bigger timescales. So what brought you to the disaster risk reduction side of things? I know you've been an author on one of the recent reports. So we'll talk about that.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks. Yeah, I've been an author on various on the global assessment report since about 2009, when we started looking at the issue of drought and food security and conflict in different parts of the world, just the links between it. I'd say the person that helped me frame this was a gentleman by the name of Gilbert White a long time ago, and the idea here was really a question that Gilbert asked, which is, if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And the issue here is, yes, within NOAA, we look at what drives the Earth system from the sun down to the seabed. But one of the things I developed for NOAA years ago, working with others there, like Claudia Nirenberg, was the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, how science gets into policy and then decision making in non-trivial ways. And then the information systems that are grounded with not just physical and social, not just co-production, but co-development of processes that shape new futures. And that's where these other programs are. So that connection comes very much from my own background and where I grew up in the Caribbean, and seeing firsthand how people responded in both communities to their day-to-day risks, and then how the society and the region itself dealt with broader aspects of things that were linked to their trade and their commodities, but also their global security. So there's a thread there in which we ask the scientific question, but we're asking, what are the consequences of use, not simply how do we apply the knowledge? So.
Yeah, and that did you have a certain? So Gilbert White was obviously influential, but I guess as a journalist, I came into the climate problem as a geophysical thing. I was writing about CO2 and how it's changing the atmosphere, and that's changing this, that, and the other. And it really took me 18 years, like from 1988 until 2006, for the social sciences, behavioral sciences, suddenly to kick me in the ass, and say, the climate isn't the only thing that's changing, and the result of a climate impact is largely based on what's happened or not happened on the ground. It was a real sort of wake-up moment for me. Did you have your own wake-up moment that brought you to Gilbert, or was there?
No, thanks for that question. No, I didn't. And the reason is, growing up in a village, growing up with people who face it day to day, the idea was not that science drove the questions, but really, how would it help us? And that was really, so I didn't have that. I mean, the first thing I ever did in climate was actually a paper on food security as an undergrad that we published, asking, how is security determined, and then where does climate fit in? So I think the thing that codified a lot of the lessons across the things we're talking about, Andy, is the special report on extremes in 2012 that IPCC did. That was the first real effort to bring together the climate people with the hazards people and with the disaster risk reduction folks, and put them all in one place. Now, putting them all in one place didn't mean it started in 2012 with that report. It meant that it began to systematize a body of knowledge that crossed all of these. So the prescriptive aspects of, here's the risk, how do we respond to it, was never my framing. It was closer to what you began with, which is even climate change, anthropogenic, not even climate change, is the outcome of the choices and the development we make. So It's not how do we respond to climate. It's what are we doing to create an unstable climate. So anyway.
Right. And so, Josh, over to you. So you have a background in education theory and design, and what pulled you into the disaster risk reduction part of all of this? And then we can talk about the results of the meeting.
Definitely, and thanks, Andy, for hosting, and Vivek and Roger for being here. Really nice just to have an opportunity to debrief the week after all these sessions. So what really got me involved in terms of the disaster risk reduction space was, as Andy knows, and what I'll kind of just recap really quickly is majority of my work is working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, here in the United States, and on a training and education program that focuses primarily on community and economic recovery, housing recovery, pandemic planning, and we're really working across states, tribes, and territories to get that message of preparedness out. With FEMA's new priorities and strategic plan, really emphasizing climate change as well as diversity and inclusion, the Sendai framework was a logical place to look at to really gather as much information as possible that we can implement now that these priorities are in place. So my time here in Bali was really as a sponge, just absorbing as much information as possible, and hopefully to build on that momentum with FEMA's new priorities.
That's great. And, I did have a conversation recently with Deanne Criswell, the FEMA administrator, and the colleague who runs the fire administration. And a lot of what we talked about, even at FEMA, was the same thing we were just talking with Mavika about, which is FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, not Federal Emergency Reduction Prevention Agency. Even the structure of FEMA and also the U.S. Fire Service, the firefighting budget, swamps the preparedness budget. I can go across the landscape of hazards, and we have this bias toward response, a little bit recovery, and the preparedness always is in the background. I just want to show you all something that as this conversation starter, because it was a little bit depressing, right? I heard yesterday, after, I think I've got this story queued up here. Okay, here we go. I wrote quite a bit about the fires that swept through the Boulder County in Colorado a number of months ago. I wrote about homes that did not burn because they had fiber cement siding right next to homes that were incinerated. I interviewed the owner of one. I talked Boulder, the county of Boulder, right in the Rockies, has a progressive wildfire building code. The towns within the county have their own standards because they're independent governments. And Superior was devastated by this fire. Hundreds of homes were burned. And earlier this week, the town board voted on the fire safety building codes, and the board failed the measure. The measure homes would have to meet roof and eave installation standards that minimize exposure of wood sheathing, have non-combustible or ignition-resistant decks, windows that are tempered, etc. Now, so they just turned this down, and they did it because of inflation. At least that was the explanation, and inertia, and that just makes my hair catch on fire. So even with direct experience, that happens. And to flip things around to a more positive side, I didn't realize this until Mavik sent me a story. There's an averted disaster award, and the global platform is the DRR is part of this, making the invisible successes visible. So that's the challenge, making them visible and then making them actionable. Like, can we flip that norm that I just described? So maybe we'll just go back to each of you, and if you either an insight you learned in Bali or an example you're familiar with that excites you, what is happening out there that feels like it could tip the balance so that we all get an averted disaster award? Mavik, in the Philippines, I did a conversation years ago with the top volcano preparedness official there, whose name I'm suddenly blanking on. And there's a lot of work underway to try to reduce risk. So what do you see, or what have you written about that excites you that relates to this possibility of moving from, status quo, inertial, economy first thinking to preparedness?
Okay, so thank you for your for giving us this space for this important topic. So here in the Philippines, one of the recent development was that an NGO is trying to reverse this law, which is the RA 10121, the PDRRM Act, which prohibits pre-disaster cash transfer. So they made a study and an actual initiative where pre-disaster aid was given through forecasting and digital payments. So they found out that it's more effective than providing aid after the disaster happened. So it's also aligned with the interviews I made, since Bicol is also typhoon prone, and the affected families would also always tell me that they would borrow first from their families, whether here in local areas or from other provinces. So they really emphasize the need for cash, not when the disaster already happened. So that's one thing that's as a journalist I'm really looking forward how it would develop, because their ultimate focus is to really reverse that law, that it's more important to provide pre-disaster aid than after. And
yeah.
Okay, that's one thing that's happening here in the Philippines.
Pre-disaster aid, yeah, that whole idea of investing
Yes.
against the law.
Using forecasting and digital payments.
I'd love to find out more about that. I'll try to find the link, or if you have the link handy, I'm going to be writing a summary of this, so that's really interesting. And Roger, in your drafting, maybe let's get to the parts of the report you worked on, and what comes to mind too for you as sort of the upside possibilities.
Yep. No, this is a really important question. And what Mavik was mentioning about things like forecast-based financing and so on are really critical. So there's several good examples around the world. I mean, we drew out in the report, like Cambodia having a reality television program that brought in people pairing with local experts to talk about not just what you ought to do in an idealized situation, but how we actually work together to make sense of risk. There's things in flood early warning in Nepal that's in the cases, a really good case in Wolong in China on the types and things that leads to effective responses, the transparency in governance, the collaboration, the evidence that goes into decision making. So, and as you know very well, Andy, I mean, the amount of the mortality, even though there seems to be some rising in the last 5 years, the mortality has actually declined over the last 40 to 50 years from hazards. And so that's a really critical success story as to how that has happened over time from the standpoint of communication and risk management. The Secretary General, as you know, has launched this entire effort on early warning.
Right.
And a big thing that we're trying to get across the board in doing that is that early warning is in fact across timescales. It's not simply early warning for something that's immediately impending, but how risk cascades through the system in the way you just described with the Marshall Fire. I live in Boulder, Colorado. And so but I am from the Caribbean, which I'll just mention in a second. One of the things that is in our report is the early warning information systems put together by the islands of the Caribbean really played a role in saving lives in 2017, 2018, and through 2020. We can do traceable accounts in which folks were able to reconstruct parts of their livelihoods, working with the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility to help restart their components. But I think what we're pointing to very clearly on the nature of community engagement and the role of evidence is how well do we need to know in order to manage a risk? There's a distraction we have that, we need to know something precisely before we act. It's what I.F. Stone used to call the Socratic fallacy, that if we don't agree on all the facts, we can't do anything. And so I think we're sort of moving away from that thread in which we're seeing that, in fact, the partnerships lead to a lot of co-benefits in action. So it doesn't have to be, what does one risk tell us? Now, in the report, there's some really good things about, what works, what doesn't work. But fundamentally, we have to ask, why aren't we putting into place more scale, at a larger scale, of the things we know that do work? So there is a lot on being proactive. But as you know, and everybody on this thread knows, that being proactive is difficult. I always like to tell people, let's be proactive, you first. And the reason is it implies some upfront costs and trade-off that folks either do not want to make or they would like to ignore. And in addition, one of the things that's in this GARN, in the last one, I led the one last year that was the first report on drought globally with 2 other main authors, was the idea of prospective risk, which is central in this. Proactive as in, what do we know and how do we respond to it, even if you don't have complete prediction skill. But the prospective aspects, which is closer to the Sustainable Development Goals, what are the levels of capabilities and equity that is not simply hazard-based, that we need to have in place that allow people to not just respond, but not to let new risks arise. That is a rich thread in this report, and chapter 12 I was involved in talks a whole lot about that. So I do want to keep some of that in mind, in addition to being reactive, compensatory, proactive. We stand back as well and ask, how are we prospective? Do we not let new things arise that create risk? And that's a form of being proactive, but we just like to frame it because it's not simply, a particular hazard base.
That's so interesting. That reminds me of the work of another Colorado-based researcher, Patrick Keyes, at Colorado State, who focuses.
Yes.
He led a paper on what he calls Anthropocene risk,
Right.
which is about stepping back from what you perceive right now and looking at these layers of historic underpinnings that drove the losses and costs. This relates to whether it's Iraq and water, or here, and hurricane vulnerability. It's really interesting.
No, I'll give Josh Mavic a chance to speak here, but you're pointing out it's something really critical in this report that I do want to point to, which is the notion that risk is accumulated over time, not simply that it is an event response. Things are fine until an event happens. Well, that we know is not true. Right? We know we deplete resources. We know we're depleting ecosystems. We also put people into places of risk and then are surprised when they're impacted. And so thinking through the notion, and you point to the Marshall Fire. Similarly, in the early 70s in New Orleans, there was a refusal to build higher and stronger levees for that reason, for the same reason you mentioned. So the accumulative nature of risk over time is a big part of the report. And so is the issue of perception, how we actually see risks in our lives. So those are things that are richly discussed in the report, and very much along the lines of what Mavic has said so far in terms of how we embed it into action.
So over to you, Josh. Again, you said you were there to be a sponge. What's some of the stuff you sponged up that relates to that you can go forward with and build into training or education programs or the like?
Yeah, I think a ton of it has come to the framing, and I think Roger was touching upon a point that I wanted to build upon at the end there. When we're working with emergency managers specifically, and we do a section on hazard identification, many of them will roll their eyes. But for people that are outside the field of emergency management, disaster risk reduction, I think many of the ways that we're framing our stories, either in a prevention sense or more commonly in the after action, we start with that hazard identification process. Although for experts, it might seem very rudimentary, there's such a strong value. And I think I heard that in the undertones of many of the presentations here, the importance of starting very first with the hazard. Specifically in one of the conversations around financing disaster risk reduction, there was the point being made that even in the financial and private sector communities, they're treating the hazard as they're treating the disaster like the hazard and not going back and starting with the hazard initially. And I think that's one of the major fallacies that we see across, and something that we could be doing better in our framing. Also with the data key. So alongside with that, there was really this undertone of making data that is, one, understandable, but then also actionable. So with our charts, can we go an extra mile to kind of have an explanation of what it truly means? And really in terms of the framing, the stories of prevention. I think that even in the closing ceremony that happened just about an hour ago, they left us with that note around thinking about covering stories and making narratives that are around prevention. And one that, as an educator, we're constantly listening for those headlines of kind of those preparedness, those prevention type success stories. One that we're constantly using is, for example, early in the pandemic, Wimbledon. The fact that Wimbledon had pandemic insurance before they canceled back in 2020. These are things that are resonating with our audiences, resonating with our students, and would love to see a lot more. So those are some of the reflections. I have plenty more from my sponge perspective, but just tying in together what we've heard so far.
Well, that takes it back to the storytelling component here. There are some wonderful experiments I've seen where the media have shifted. Well, I won't say the media, not yet. Where some geographers have built ways to show drivers of risk that are novel and I think really promising. The Steve Strader and Walker Ashley have this expanding bullseye model where they show demographic change over time in a region. You can see, a town becomes a city, becomes a sprawling suburb, and that changes how many people are living in flood zones faster than the floods are changing. So the floods are the hazard. People are moving into that zone faster, as is true almost everywhere around the world. People are moving into zones of hazard faster than the hazards are changing. So what in Roger at NOAA, you guys are doing some really great work with the weather folks, but there's also, what are frontiers like there in visualization or engagement? Maybe Roger
or
John,
we could go back to Mavic if you want.
May I add on the on understanding risk? I guess there's really misconceptions, and the clamor for local knowledge is a symptom that there's really a need to understand. For instance, what happened with Haiyan, there was really not a clear understanding of what storm surge was. So yeah, that's one factor that affected the outcome or the result of the super typhoon on Tacloban. So yeah, so in fact there are still some media outlets that use natural disasters when there's no such thing, right? So disasters, as anthropologists and scientists and specialists would point out, is a result of poor actions and even inactions or maladaptation. So here in the Philippines, there are groups, or especially among farmers, who are gathering monthly to discuss how climate is affecting them. So it's important for our climate change commission to really put this to make this more organized, so that knowledge are documented, recorded, and we have access also to this. And they are also asking for support on how they can build more on this knowledge, on how they can proactively respond, because they have the knowledge, but they also need support. And then I also hope that there would be more a call for historical markers, as one expert is promoting here in Bicol, that historical markers should be prioritized, so that people would not forget what these disasters could do and what kind of disaster did that.
You're reminding me of the tsunami stones in Japan. There are these. I wrote about this after Fukushima. These stones that say they date back many centuries, and they say, "Beware the big waves. Don't build below this mark." Unfortunately, time goes by, and there's this thing called disaster amnesia that can be very short, actually, that kicks in. But that's a really important. One thing you mentioned, Mavik, is culturally appropriate communication. It's fine
Yes.
for the UN to put out a report. It's fine for me to write something in English. The Earth Observatory of Singapore, I think, has done a really good job of doing geohazard communication in locally relevant ways with animations and films that are in local languages. Indonesia has dozens of languages. The Philippines, I think, has many as well. So that seems to make it complex, but also leads to lots of opportunity.
Necessary. Yeah, it's necessary.
Yeah. Actually, before we move on, Mavik, how important is radio? I know radio in Africa, radio and now SMS and things like that increasingly are a way for messages to get out really efficiently, even if someone can't read, even if they're in a remote area. Is that part of the mix in the Philippines too?
Yes, yes, especially the radio programs have also link to online platform. So they're also
Right.
transitioning, yes, into digital communication.
As we all are. So what were some of the frontiers, Roger, that you see that are like about the communication component that really make a difference?
Yeah, so you know, I always communication is a rich point. I always tell people, you know, if we're serious about reducing risk and vulnerability, we have to also realize that that how risk is created is not simply amenable to better communication. um, and so we have, exactly as Mavik was saying, a lot of efforts on how we visualize, how people see themselves entering into you know, risky conditions and situations, and a lot is being used in the Famine Early Warning System Network in East Africa right now. Actually, we have a really rich set of stories surrounding that. For those of on the cast that might not know about the Famine Early Warning System Network, it came out of
Right.
Live Aid and Band Aid that I think only Andy and I are old enough to remember. And the idea, what was related to that, was that scientific institutions around the world started to work together, especially NASA and NOAA and USGS, working with people on the ground in Ethiopia and elsewhere, on visualizing future, you know, the things that were happening to the monsoon and so on. And we could point very directly in 2016, 2017, in which there was a drought that was worse than the 83, 84 drought, but you didn't hear about it globally. So this is your point for the entire podcast, Andy. The fact that, you know, when's the success the story?
Right.
And so pulling those out, I think, become really critical. So one of the things we're trying to do visually is show, you know, how you know, decisions that and perverse incentives actually cascade into poor, risky decisions. As Mavik was pointing out, a disaster is something that happens when it overwhelms our capabilities. It's not that the hazard doesn't happen. It's when it overwhelms our capabilities. And then the other sets of cycles that are in there to produce some imagery on where the entry points are within very complex systems in order to change their trajectory. That's a lot of good work that's being done in the visual arena, a lot in the integrated assessment kind of framing, as long as we keep in mind that integrated assessments are not predictions. They're heuristics for thinking about risk, not for
Right.
you know, predicting the future. And so from that standpoint, to something Mavik just said, I wanted to make sure we keep in mind. And actually, Josh mentioned it as well. You hear about going down to the last mile in order to communicate with people. But we make a strong case in the report and in this platform that you also need to come up from the last mile, right? The whole idea of early warning is not just decisions about risk, it's information and decisions coming from places of risk. And so how we visualize and make that connection between the bottom up and the top down is critical, but we're trying not to be naive about it. We're not trying to say, oh, everything's local.
Right.
Well, not if you need funding or accountability data and so on. So we're really taking it seriously that we're not sort of discovering the local at every meeting, but asking what is needed at each scale and then picturing that in terms of visualization. The other type of thing that we're doing a lot of is actually the visualization of thresholds, which, as we know, is becoming a bigger question. By definition, a threshold is not predictable. And so we have to imagine them as in terms of scenarios and in terms of imagining futures. That's a genuine notion of co-production rather than give me your data and we'll write a paper together. So I want to make sure that we're picturing and imagining the future. And so a lot of the visualization has to do with that and with how risks cascade into our systems.
Yeah, this idea of the bottom up or two-way way of thinking and acting is so important. I think I've got it queued up here. Yeah, I wanted to show this. In Jakarta, I learned in a recent program where I was involved with Jim Moffat from Twitter. Twitter produces streams of data that can be harnessed in real time. And in Jakarta, the Petabenkana agency there has this amazing, let me just show you this. It's a way of tracking real-time flood intensity across Jakarta, and the information coming in is from tweets. And then information goes out when you post a tweet. You have to have an app on your phone that's specific to this because Twitter is otherwise the location is private. So it's the community and the agency talking to each other in ways that seems fantastically spreadable. That hasn't been. He pointed. I think there are some communities in the States. Texas has a live Twitter flood gauge system where the gauges are tweeting.
Yeah, and we're familiar, very familiar with those. We also have a really close partnership with Google called the Climate Engine, in which basically we're pulling in Landsat data and information in the matter of an afternoon, and then grounding it with what people are calling in and things like that. So yeah, the as you know, Andy, we were into data before it was big.
Oh, I like that. I do like that. And here's one other thing. I did want to show the expanding by way of mapping exposure. This is really exposure, not so much vulnerability. And it shows you this is an idealized situation of what that is a tornado track, but it could be a river basin, flood basin or whatever. And the population growth is a series of rings for density. And you can see over time going forward through 2100, you're raising risk, even if that tornado dynamic is the same. And it just shows you, to me, it's any media output can have that component. Steve Strader did a piece for the New York Times when Hurricane Florence was heading toward the Carolinas, where he basically was able to show, by the way, Carolinas, here's the areas where you have 10 times more houses than you had 60 years ago. Right. So focus your attention there. It just feels like there's much that can be done here.
Yeah, no, Andy, I'd like to hear, Josh and Alex take on this, because those tools are extremely important. They're very good for, saving lives and sometimes property. But as you know really well, the idea is not everybody has the choice of where they live. And a big part of what the report talks about is the role of equity, right? Who lives where? And for us, certainly in the East Coast of the United States, we can say, oh, people should be, we had the Takings Act and all of this stuff. Well, the service economies and the folks that work in the hotels and the resorts, where else do they live? So there's the aspect of, where does choice actually come in? And it's important to see visually where some of those are. As one of my other mentors, the guy that pretty much created the field of tropical meteorology, had the first female PhD in meteorology, Joanne Simpson, who really used to say, nice to see old results in color.
I'm writing down her name. That's pretty cool. But Josh, again, how does this play forward? You were thinking about an agency like FEMA or counterparts at the local level or global level, proactivity. Is there a role for communication? I actually worked a little bit on the global assessment report language until I ran out of time. I had no time. But so what are the insights that can kind of become actionable?
Well, I think it's always interesting to look at communications next to education, because I think with communications, we're really given the bits and pieces that we really need to kind of construct a portfolio of visualizations, of stories, that when these long-term engagements, whether it's teaching a university level class, a K through 12 class, or training professionals and practitioners, sometimes they'll get visualization fatigue, so we show them four charts back to back to back. That learning is diminishing. So really working very closely with our communication partners on, yes, this is a beautiful visualization on flooding and on risk. How does that translate? And do we equip our educators with prompts and conversation pieces? Because I think one trend that we're seeing more often is when we're implementing anything disaster preparedness into the classrooms, educators are leaning towards secondary sources. So there's still kind of this gap of equipping a confidence level for teachers to actually explain these charts, to teach these charts, these visualizations, whatever they might be, firsthand. So if there's going to be such preference towards secondary sources for this, equipping those secondary sources, whether it's communications, it's their data sets, with things that are going to be effective in the classroom. So for me, it's always a difficult activity to really distinguish, which visualization is going to be the most effective in our classrooms. And one that comes to mind from a course that we did at Columbia Climate School with my colleague, Dr. Tom Chandler. First, we showed people a map of redlining in the United States, and then immediately after we showed them a map of a flood map, and students took a massive takeaway from that and seeing those two visualizations side by side. But to my earlier point, the following week or the following class, we probably can't pull off another map out of our card deck, So really thinking strategically of what this approach looks like for the highest level of learning.
That's so interesting. To me, part of this is teaching a capacity to do your own mental twist and think, well, how do I know this? I'm hearing climate change, but is this something about what's the racist background that's led to? So it really is a mode of thought that needs to be propagated more than a specific nugget of information. I don't know if that resonates. And Mavik, this is, you talk about, I've had solutions journalism founders on here, Tina Rosenberg and others, and they're trying to change the mode of thought in the newsroom. And that it's really hard. Mavik, you're an independent journalist. You need to sell your stories in a way to an editor, right? Or sometimes an editor will assign you a story. How does that challenge play out? How hard is it to take the knowledge you have, including what we're talking about now, and get through the filters to have a story that captures that reality?
Yes, a few years back, it was harder than now, because I've been monitoring the stories that media outlets I've been contributing to, and I've seen. I'm really happy that I've seen solutions-oriented stories more this year than before, or than last year, because yes, it was hard to really pitch these stories, because it is not something that we journalists and editors are accustomed to doing. So I'm just glad that I am seeing more solutions stories now than before.
Mavik, I think not to run this to get an Andy.
Please.
Andy, you mentioned something I do want to mention, which is central in the report, which is there's a lot in there on trying to take people's mental models and cognitive biases as they exist, as opposed to saying, "Oh, you need to change your mind," and work on, from everybody from Kahneman to Slovik, and on how to sort of enter into how people think about risk, perceive action, and so on. There's a lot more that we're uncovering that is not just individual cognition and communication, but the role, the psychology of the individual in a network, how he or she plays in a network, and what that means, how they get respect, how they get, things like that. That is not just the cognitive aspects, but that is a key part, the design system, to try and factor in how the research on how we actually think versus saying how we ought to think. to Mavik's point, I do think, we as you mentioned, there's classes and racism, but every culture has gender issues. Every culture. And it's the one few generalizations I can make. And I think a big part of this report is actually trying to get at how do we not simply say, how do you reach vulnerable women, but the role that women actually play in disaster risk reduction and management. Years ago, colleagues of mine, Walt Peacock and others, had shown that, in fact, during Hurricane Andrew, the group that was last to actually access aid was single female heads of household, because they were worried about providing nutrition for kids and helping save people immediately. So there's an aspect here that is not just who is vulnerable, but who is capable in terms of gender. And I kind of want to make sure that we're in the effort to point at differentials, there's a lot of resources we're not using.
That's so important. And, there's one thing that I haven't seen, even in the climate reports, that doesn't seem to be in the foreground often, which is just, we talk about how all the SDGs, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, are affected by climate. But
right.
What I haven't seen a lot, and I'm just thinking this now, is if you work on those goals, you definitely get a fundamentally better result in dealing with disaster.
Yeah, and that's what I meant by working up.
Women, literacy. Yeah. So that builds an ecosystem that's so much more responsive and adaptive and innovative.
That's what we mean by prospective risk, right? The things you do that actually gets us more capable, more responsive, more equitable, that lets you manage risk. And let's be clear, right? The IPCC reports are extremely good, but they're meant for negotiation on emissions, not for application at local levels. And that's been a confusion. And I was the convening lead author in the last one for adaptation. And it's very much how this matters to what we say about emissions, not how do you apply it to the local level. So,
yeah, and the whole history of the IPCC, I've been writing about this, as you know, since before there was an IPCC. And it was always climate in the foreground, obviously. It's a climate report. It's not
it was climate change. We think of climate as anything that's 2 weeks or longer, right? El Nino is climate, right? So
right.
That's
right. And that there's a fundamental bias there. It's like if you ask someone, I will take this, George Bush, and when he got to the White House, he asked the National Academy of Sciences to delineate the uncertainties in climate science. And they gave him the answer.
Yeah.
And that was used to justify delay initially. He changed.
I remember that. Yes, the uncertainty transfer. If you don't know one thing, you don't know anything. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you come at a problem and climate science is your lens, whether you're a climate scientist or like me, a journalist in the beginning, you kind of have this built-in. You're captured by a certain narrative, and that I think. And
it would be good. I mean, Josh and Mavic have been talking about it, so I'd like to hear more about it, because the disaster risk lens is critical. One of the things we're advancing is that you cannot do, with the Secretary General, you cannot do climate adaptation without effective disaster risk reduction. It's not just an add-on. It is what helps determine. But your bigger point is the thing. It's about risk reduction and reducing vulnerability. The disasters or the hazards, climate, and so on are factors that help create those, but it is about reducing people's vulnerability, regardless of the driver.
So where do we go from here? We're toward the end of the hour. I'm sorry some of the others couldn't come on. I know we're all scattered and over the world. And what would be a next step? Who should be, if we wanted to kind of zoom in on the role of communication and media here? Maybe we could do a deeper dive on that component of the report in a future conversation. What would that look like?
Go ahead.
Mavik, I know, I've been involved with the Earth Journalism Network, and they have they've developed a whole suite of really great tools that I think can be adapted to this landscape. Here's the geojournalism platform that started with Info Amazonia. Is it's sort of a collaborative, mapped approach to journalism across these landscapes: the Himalayas, the Amazon, the Mekong. And it feels like a way to capture some of these regional issues and opportunities that maybe a single story in a single newspaper can't do. Mavik, are you involved with some of that? Or, would you like to be involved?
In the Mekong I think I'm part of that, although Philippines is not part of that region, but I think yes, because it's part of Earth Journalism Network.
Yeah, it feels like a way to approach an issue. Again, the geohazard landscape across Southeast Asia has these components that are all interrelated. The peat fires in Indonesia created terrible air pollution in Singapore, and when you have, or obviously a tsunami risk is a whole region. It feels like a good way to have an approach to collaborative storytelling or engagement tools. So maybe there's something I could reach out to them about taking another step, looking at the GAR, looking at this assessment report, and saying, well, what's the role of journalism in building on that would be really cool. We'll see. And for you guys, for Josh, we have a journalism school at Columbia that doesn't talk very much to the rest of us, even though I went there in 1981, 82. There's a new dean. Maybe we can get him. Maybe we can get them excited. And there is the Covering Climate Now network. And what's the training like? Is there a communication component to some of the work you guys do with the first, with the disaster preparedness community?
Yeah, and I want to kind of tie in some earlier points around mental models, and Andy knows this, not the rest of the group might not, but that's kind of where I root a lot of my research, is looking at adult development, climate change and cognition, and thinking through what that looks like and translates in the classroom. And I think that ties into Andy's point there with how would we strategically align with journalism and our School of Journalism that's a next door neighbor to us, is really looking at those higher levels of cognitive processing. What are these stories that are going to be memorable? Even amongst our communities, we lose track of disasters, we lose track of what the names were. We might know the statistics about it, but moving away from solely kind of that quantitative, analytical knowledge dump, and think about that perceptual, relatable things that will stick in memory. So that is a call to action really for the education community and the journalism community to work closer together on how those are framed. Even looking at some research that can be done around what stories do have that effect size with people that resonates with them. And I think that goes back to broadening, taking a more broader approach to systems thinking to long-term, short-term, all these other cognitive dimensions that are not solely knowing the ins and outs of our preparedness frameworks. And one thing that I want to kind of err as caution in kind of seeing kind of the disaster risk reduction start to really gain traction in the education realms is that it doesn't succumb to similar biases that the climate science has, unfortunately, in terms of reaching the general public, where we focus too much on that quantitative, too much on the modeling, and not how this directly affects that person's livelihoods or their future dreams, occupations, their family members. And I think that's really what we'll be able to hit a lot of these points and bring it home. So those are some of my thoughts for next steps. And Andy, whatever you can do to tap into your alumni base over there and see what we can do at Columbia, I'm happy, of course, to be a part of that. And Roger, Mavik, I'm sure there's going to be overlap where we'll be calling you up as well.
Well, I think, Mavik made the clear point about historical touchstones. And Patty Limerick, a historian that works at the University of Colorado, and myself have done a ton of stuff with what people in political offices use as symbols when they describe the environmental changes in the West and, in the middle of a drought right now, and then which events actually are part of their narrative and why. And I've been able to work with both sides of the aisle very, very closely based on the reconstruction of the experience of their families, from everything from the Dust Bowl to the droughts in the 1977, which was a pretty critical thing so that, as we all know on this sort of call, that the world is made up, we study particles, but humans are made up of stories. And so the idea here is really, if I were to say something in the context where some research in journalism could actually help us, I don't know, you probably are, Andy, because it's within your portfolio. Jonathan Rauch did a really good paper on the constitution of knowledge. And he points to the constitution of knowledge as coming from academia, the media, law, and government. And if you can place the role of communications within the constitution of knowledge, we get a fundamental question about change and crafting a future together, which is not just, we need to know this, not just how is advice on risk, uncertainty, ambiguity actually crafted, but really how do policy and political processes help us understand what counts as authoritative. Otherwise, we'll be lost in trying to, the old, it's been known for a long time, if you beat people over the head with a fact, they listen less. I don't know why people think that's a new thing. We all think like,
Right.
So we're uncovering a lot of stuff in the context of climate that's been known for a long time, such as risk and disaster risk reduction and perception. But I do think we need, and that's a really, really good case on the Rhine, right? Not just in developing areas. This notion of what constitutes authority in the context of knowledge and the role that journalism plays in that.
Well, that point you made, Roger, about working with the mind you have, the minds people have and communities have, and the systems they have, rather than thinking you can change those components at least quickly, seems really important. And Aviva Ramani, who's an artist focused on the environment, had posted a note. She says reports from colleagues attending science conferences, the word is that our environmental groups are even more hostile to art than ever. I find that hard to believe. I
Really?
think, but I'll have to ask her. Maybe Aviva, I'll get you on a show in the future.
We had a whole session on art and disaster risk reduction, and that we put together for this, and then even a theatrical play and some of it. But there's a lot.
I hope some of that was recorded. I'd love to kind of get back.
I'm surprised with that, but there must be a basis. So it'd be good to know.
We'll find out in a future show. We have a couple more minutes. I pulled this together when I was writing about the general issue of vulnerability. History gets forgotten so often. A lot of the conversation in Europe was about climate change again. When you look deeply at the mortality, the terrible mortality in that flood around Blessem and those areas, it was vulnerability still. There was a house, community, a house for disabled people where 11 people died, and they didn't have a strategy to get them out. Flash floods present a really enormous challenge because they can happen pretty much anywhere. But historically, there's this wonderful book that I have here about New York. It's called Hidden Waters.
Hidden Waters. Yeah.
And what it is a history of, you look at the map of New York City and you're looking at a map of hydrology.
Yeah, we call it the hydrological cycle for a reason. Right?
Say that again?
The hydrological cycle.
Illogical.
Yes, because we forget, because of what, after the issue attention cycle disappears, we then forget it, right? So it's the hydro, and that's an old thing that we use. But what you're saying is exactly right. We lose track of the accumulation of risky situations, of which understanding how hydrology, the way beyond Carl Wood-Fogel's hydrologic civilization, just the networks that we build and how we're dependent on natural systems and human systems. So,
wow.
Rock and or roll.
Well, it's been great to have you all on here today. This is an introduction to the ideas emerging from the global platform on disaster risk reduction and the underlying global assessment report. These documents are big. The illumination that comes from them is complex, and it'll take time to distill and get this out into the world. So I hope you'll.
I do want to add one point to that. Unlike
Please do.
Even the IPCC that Mavic and Josh knows extremely well. The one thing with this particular kind of global assessment and so on, it is very much geared towards the partners and the implementers in the UNDR offices and the UN offices, and they're leveraging financing capabilities there. So I'd like to make sure we make that point, that it's not a big report tossed into the vacuum. There's a whole lot of regional and local mechanisms that are tied to not just what's in the report, but where it goes. And so there's a lot of stuff coming out of this on how that engagement takes place. In fact, a lot of this has led now to the development of a new center to try and get around some of these between the WMO and UNDRR to link disaster risk reduction and adaptation. I'm helping with some of that, but I'm just saying that I appreciate the point, and that's mostly the case. But the GARs are really targeted at local, regional, and national implementation.
And one of the most interesting aspects of the DRR itself, I think, if I'm correct, I think there are 8 regional hubs. Pretty sure, and there, the idea of tuning this to that level, making sure those conversations go forward, and also, testing. One of the most valuable things about the IPCC history is it's an iterative. It gives you a timeline and a way to gauge what's happening and not happening, and with some authority and some numbers. And the GAR process has some of that value too. Josh, I think it looks like you might have a final thought too.
Oh, no, I didn't. I think it just scratched my face there at the end there.
No, that's fine. Well, again, here's hoping that we can, as I said at the beginning, have a newspaper called Safer Times someday, and we can figure out ways to tell these stories that can really change outcomes on the ground. And we have to work on this. I hate the word we. I'm just trying to drop the word we.
I know.
Who's the we? Lots of work can be done at every level.
A lot of work can be done. Yeah, I do think from the journalism standpoint, Andy, and from our standpoint, the best case you can help us make that acting on disasters is not just about disasters, right? It's about development ecosystems and all the other benefits that come along with it. I think that's a necessary thread we haven't pulled hard enough on.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for being here today, Vikande, Roger Pulwardi, Josh DiVincenzo, and on we go. Have safe travels coming home. And the last time I was in Bali, the only time I was in Bali was in 1979. I was circling the world on a sailboat as a young man.
That sounds like Andy Revkin.
Yeah. So I'd like to get back someday and see how much change has happened for better or worse. Take care of yourselves, and
good to see you. Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks again for doing this.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.